Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
New year, new administration. This week on Bloomberg Green, Joe Biden is set to become America's greenest president ever. Is Georgia, though, the final key to unlock his ambitious climate plan? And the team who help him deliver on his promises, the names you need to know, including my interview with his climate czar, Gina McCarthy. Plus, there's a lot to be optimistic about going into 2021. From greener beer cans to eco-friendly cereal, we'll take a look at the good news on climate. I'm Amber Hordern in London, and this is Bloomberg Green. Let's get to your Green in Brief with Jennifer Zabazaja.
I'm Jennifer Zabazaja in New York. Here's everything you need to know in Green this week. President Trump's Environmental Protection Agency is looking to tie President-elect Biden's hands. It wants to block the use of non-public information when it drafts new rules. The EPA has long used medical details to assess the impact of pollution. Any change could hamper the Biden administration's climate agenda. President Trump is facing another legal battle, this time over solar panels. A trade group is leading a challenge to a presidential order that tightened tariffs on imported equipment. They say the White House didn't follow the proper procedures. Britain's power grid saw its greenest year on record. The government and businesses are paring back emissions and relying less on fossil fuels to keep the lights on. 2020 saw the longest period without coal power since the Industrial Revolution. And the Christmas tree might be green, but the festive season is anything but. According to recycling firm tradewaste.co.uk, Brits threw away 300,000 metric tons of waste. That includes 50,000 tons of leftover dinner and 30,000 tons of Christmas cards. And that's your Green Brief.
Joe Biden in the White House means a whole different approach to the climate from the United States. So what exactly is his plan and what happens next? Bloomberg's Akshat Rati explains.
Green New Deal or not, Joe Biden changes the climate game for everyone in the world. When Joe Biden was projected to become the next US president, climate scientists let out a collective sigh of relief. That's not an exaggeration. For 4 years, President Donald Trump's administration often denied that climate change was even happening or that humans were the main cause.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Well, I don't think science knows, actually.
Both stances that go completely against the scientific consensus. Then, the administration cozied up to the fossil fuel industry, rolling back regulations and increasing emissions. When Biden takes office, it will be a big change, simply because he understands the science and he is interested in cutting emissions. But that's not all. He also has a decent plan to execute. So, what is his plan? It's not the Green New Deal, which is a term Biden's opposition has made toxic. But Biden's plan has many of the elements needed to cut emissions. First, he'll rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and commit the US to reach net zero emissions no later than 2050. That's crucial. The US is the only country not party to the Paris Accord, and to tackle climate change, all countries need to cut emissions and fast. Second, he'll create green jobs and lots of them. The pandemic caused an economic recession. Biden will have to bring the virus under control and spur economic recovery by creating lots of jobs. If those jobs go to the fossil fuel industry or in building carbon-heavy infrastructure, Biden cannot meet his climate ambition. He will need to create jobs in renewable energy, insulating homes, and adapting infrastructure to a warming planet. Third, he'll make huge investments in clean energy. He's promised to spend $2 trillion on initiatives such as providing carbon-free electricity by 2035. No large country has yet made that promise. He will increase investments in research and innovation. Solar power is cheap today because governments subsidized it when it was expensive. That helped spur technology development and drive down the cost curve. And his plan will address environmental injustices. People of color suffer from climate harm much more than others do. Biden will direct many of his investments to overcoming such inequities. Biden's plan received high marks from experts, but how much can he really achieve? That's still an open question. Biden can achieve a lot through executive action, but if he is to pass legislation, he's going to require the support of both houses of Congress. What is clear, however, is that Biden will actually work to cut emissions, rather than be indifferent to rising emissions as his predecessor was. That changes the climate game for all of us.
Now let's dig a little bit deeper into what a Biden-Harris administration could achieve on climate on day one. Bloomberg News' Will Wade joins me now from New York. Will, we do have Georgia flipping to the Democrats, which gives the Senate a Democrat lean. Does this embolden Biden and his climate plans?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to give him a much freer hand for his climate agenda, and he's announced some really big plans.
So what can actually be done on day one?
Well, we know that on day one, he's going to rejoin the Paris Agreement. That's pretty simple. He just signs a piece of paper, and 30 days later, we're in. But there's other things he could pursue that are going to be a little more complicated. One of the things we heard a lot about during the campaign was fracking. Fracking is huge. It's made the U.S. the world's biggest natural gas supplier. And it's a big part of the economy. Oil and gas employs 9 million people in the United States, give or take. But there's a lot of controversy about the environmental impact of fracking, and there's a bigger push now to get away from gas as a source of electricity because of the emissions. So he could potentially announce a ban on new fracking on federal lands, but that would probably lead to court challenges. It would be very controversial. An easier move would be to announce a comprehensive review of the entire gas leasing program. And when I say comprehensive, I mean really comprehensive. This could literally take years. And while it's going on, they wouldn't be allowed to offer any new leasing for fracking. And there'd be no way to challenge that in court.
Right. You made the point in your piece that this worked for Obama when it came to the coal industry in 2016. What would be out of his reach that he couldn't be able to change during his administration?
Well, there's probably no way we could get national clean energy targets. We've seen about a dozen states announce different types of clean energy policies. A lot of them are calling for 100% clean energy by a certain target date. It would be a lot easier to let the states continue that. Trying to implement that kind of policy on a national level would have to go through Congress, and even with control of both houses, that would be a stretch.
There's enough energy in the winds off of the U.S. coastlines to power the entire country. Is this something you think we'll see ambitious action from the Biden administration on?
Yeah, definitely. The U.S. offshore wind industry is tiny. It's really big in Europe, but right now we've only got 2 tiny demonstration plants in operation. But we've had developers announce proposals for about 29 gigawatts of offshore wind projects just on the East Coast, and that's about as big as a third of the entire U.S. nuclear fleet. But right now, none of those programs have been approved. There's about a dozen different projects that are being evaluated by BOEM, that's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is in charge of permitting those. Biden could accelerate that just by throwing some money to BOEM and giving them more manpower to evaluate those proposals.
All right, Will Wade, Bloomberg News reporter in New York. Thank you so much for joining Bloomberg Green today.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, red, white, blue, and green. U.S. climate policy is set to make a 180, and we'll speak to the woman about to turn it upside down. Joe Biden's top domestic climate official, Gina McCarthy. That's next. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Mamrie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Now, Joe Biden has made climate action one of his top priorities upon entering the White House. Here's a look at the first ever climate team.
In 2020, climate change finally made it onto the ballot. According to Pew Research, 42% of voters claimed that a candidate's stance on climate change was very important to their vote. That number rose to 68% for Biden voters. So it's no surprise that President-elect Biden has made climate change one of his key priorities.
They've given us a mandate for action on COVID, the economy, climate change, systemic racism.
Let's take a closer look at the president-elect's picks. The former Secretary of State was one of the key architects of the Paris Climate Agreement, signing the document in 2015 on behalf of the United States. His role is to act as a senior advisor to the president on climate-related policy and decisions, one which has been elevated for the first time to be part of the National Security Council. Granholm was the first female governor of Michigan. Her work to reinvigorate Michigan's auto industry during the financial crisis will give the Biden administration insight into the transition to electric vehicles. As well as advising on energy policy, Granholm's docket includes overseeing the nuclear weapons stockpile. Republican lawmakers said to expect a brawl after Haaland's nomination, as she is a vocal supporter of the Green New Deal. If confirmed, she will make history as the first Native American to hold a cabinet position. The role entails overseeing public and federal lands, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Another potential history maker, Michael Regan, could become the first black administrator of the EPA. He began his career working for the agency during the Clinton administration. Then, in 2017, he facilitated the biggest coal waste cleanup in the U.S. The EPA advises on climate issues and enforces new laws. A lawyer who is currently Director of Regulatory Policy at the Southern Environmental Law Center, Mallory is another face from the Obama administration. The council works with the president and respective agencies to implement new environmental policies. A household name to many in the climate world, Gina McCarthy was head of the EPA during President Obama's second term. She made landmark changes to the Clean Water Act, as well as finalizing the Clean Power Plan, setting the U.S. on track with the Paris Agreement. She will head up the new White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, directly assisting Joe Biden in coordinating his climate plans.
And I spoke with Gina McCarthy, the incoming climate czar, about her expectations for the Biden-Harris administration.
He cannot just sign the Paris Agreement, which he said he is, and I'm confident he will, but he should rejoin the World Health Organization. Climate change is also a public health crisis. It's not a planetary illness. It is a people problem. But he can also move forward using his executive orders and the strength of his administration. I expect that he'll run on regulating the power sector. I think you're going to see him jump at car standards, and I'm excited about the way he can bring labor into that discussion in a fulsome way. A lot of opportunities for changing the dynamic about how we think about climate and the environment, to do a 180 from where the prior administration was, but to really invest in people and their health and our kids' future.
What do you say to those that feel like the Trump administration has been beneficial to them because they work in oil and gas and they work in coal and they're worried about their livelihoods?
Trump's agenda has been about saving coal, bringing it back. 4 years didn't work for coal, and it didn't work simply because coal is no longer the fuel of choice. And we've known that it's been waning in terms of its ability to compete economically since the 80s. On oil and gas, somebody just needs to get their arithmetic right here. They now have 3 times as many people in clean energy employment when compared to oil and gas. Oil and gas is not the job stronghold. Now, in some states, clearly it's an important part of their economy, but that doesn't mean you can't transition that economy over time. They need a Joe Biden who can bring people together again, to talk to them where they are, to tell them that we're not going to allow air pollution to continue to excel your risk of dying from COVID-19, and that we have a better path forward. It requires a transition from fossil fuels. It doesn't require anybody to be without a job. We're better than that. We're smarter than that. And if people can take that deep breath, we can show that path forward.
What do you think the next 5 years this global agreement should be focusing on?
The next 5 years for many of us that look at the climate science is the make or break time. It is going to be a time for us to get together and commit to a 2030 goal that is substantive. And what I mean by substantive is it gets us a significant amount of the way forward on our 2050 net zero goal, which Biden has embraced in other countries. The EU has already put out significant commitment to investment and climate change actions, which is over $500 billion. Part of it is really getting realistic commitments and tracking them and reporting on them in ways that allow the international community, as well as individuals like you and I, to know whether people are on track. And that's really what the entire Paris Agreement was all about. Not just establishing commitments, but bringing everybody together in a transparent way to be able to track that. Clearly, the U.S. is not meeting its commitment. The 2030 commitments for everyone has to be tougher and tougher. But also, clearly, people's understanding of the threat of climate, because they now can see it, feel it, and taste it, is the good news and the worst news ever.
What are you most excited about or optimistic about in your field of science, climate, policy making?
I think that the challenge and the great thing about today is that we do have an opportunity once and for all to stop the fallacy that if you want a strong economy, then it has to come at risk to the environment. And that if you have a strong environment, somehow it's risking your ability to be economically strong. This is our opportunity under this administration to give the proper visibility to the fact that you can address a pandemic. You can address our economy through investments in clean energy. Government's job is to protect people and to make sure that businesses that do their jobs right and protect their workers and pay workers a fair wage are the ones that deserve the applause. Climate brings those issues together because in the end, it is going to have to be a shift in how we grow our economy.
Coming up, cause for optimism. The pandemic and lockdowns are continuing into 2021, but in terms of the climate, things may be looking up. The good news next. This is Bloomberg Green.
2020 is an extraordinary year. In the face of the sudden coronavirus pandemic, we put people and their lives first. We wrote the story of tackling the pandemic with concerted efforts and perseverance.
A year in which the government was forced to tell people how to live their lives, how long to wash their hands, how many households could meet together. And a year in which we lost too many loved ones before their time.
There's never been a single thing America's been unable to overcome, no matter how drastic it's been.
The coronavirus pandemic has been and continues to be a political, social, and economic challenge of the century.
We can see that illuminated sign that marks the end of the journey. And even more important, we can see with growing clarity exactly how we're going to get there. And that is what gives me such confidence about 2021.
In London, I'm Amory Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Let's start off the new year with some good news. From fresh pledges to go net zero to cutting out the waste from our food chain, there's plenty of reasons to be optimistic in 2021. I spoke to our reporter Jess Schenkelman about the new ways big companies are cutting emissions.
I want to start with what Anheuser-Busch is doing, AB InBev, in terms of making these beer cans greener. How are they doing this?
Well, yeah, exactly. This is the largest brewery in the world, and they're saying the can of beer that you drink from is going to be eco-friendly. How are they doing that? Well, aluminium is the most carbon-intensive metal to produce, but there are some places where it's produced using hydropower. So Rio Tinto is doing that with smelters in Canada. And even though hydropower is a bit of a controversial renewable energy at times, it is carbon-free. So that's how they're kind of getting right through the nuts and bolts of the supply chain, right down to, it's not just the product in the can, it's not just the transport, how it's getting there, how it's being flown over. It's also the very can that you're drinking from. But what's also important is that it has to be recycled as well, because this idea of scope 3 emissions doesn't just cover the supply chains, but also how the consumers use it in the end.
Right, so a greener beer can, but don't forget you want to put that in the recycling bin.
Yeah.
What about what I'm reading about eco-friendly cereal? What does that even mean? How do you make cereal greener?
So same idea again, that companies are now thinking right throughout their supply chains, and General Mills is saying that it's going to try to do more kind of like what they're calling regenerative agriculture, so it's less damage to the soil, and focusing on more conservation techniques. So their plan is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade by 30% across the entire life chain of its products, and it means that these practices will reduce the carbon emissions in agriculture, which will ultimately mean that you're having a greener bowl of Cheerios in the morning.
Right. Okay. So those are the companies. Going to 2021, we also have a lot of nations making these lofty climate pledges, Japan being one of them, a pretty big target for 2050.
Yeah, Japan's very interesting country because it's traditionally been a bit of a laggard in climate policies, and then kind of surprised everyone around towards the end of last year by announcing that it was going to have net zero emissions by 2050. China has a similar target, the UK has a similar target, and European Union has a similar target. The question now is, how is it going to get there? Because its current policies are way off track to deliver anything like that. We did some analysis that showed it probably would need to quadruple the pace at which it gets rid of coal for electricity in order to reach that target. That's going to have a really interesting knock-on effect on countries like Australia, because Australia supplies the coal to Japan, so it's going to be losing one of its biggest customers. So Japan's goal is going to put pressure on Australia to also step up with a new climate target. Boris Johnson, who is leading the COP26 talks this year, is trying to encourage Scott Morrison to change his policy. So it'll be interesting to watch this year to see if he actually does anything.
That does it for this week, but keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. From London, I'm Amory Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.